Hello, this is a talk I'm going to give tomorrow at a conference here in Hong Kong at Lingnan University, which is going to focus on comparative culturology. And I'm part of a session talking about invariance. And my point that I'm trying to convince you of is that invariance is actually a more theoretical question rather than a statistical question. Trying to convince you, like drawing upon some recent papers of our group, that if we start reflecting about invariance at a more broader theoretical level, we can actually really gain new insights into culture. To give you a really quick overview, I will start off with definitions of culture, and then start discussing a little bit how we typically research culture. And because it's based on surveys, I will give a brief overview of some cognitive theories of survey responding. And hopefully that will convince you that we really need to think through how people understand surveys and respond to surveys. And this is what typically invariance has been about in a very narrow sense, like focusing on specific selected statistical parameters. But I argue that there's a broader sense of invariance, and we have been discussing a 5-stage invariance cycle throughout the whole research process. And I'm going to focus specifically on two parts in that cycle that deal more with the theoretical questions, and I will talk also a little bit about some multi-level issues and then some outlook on invariance analyses and meaning making in the future. So, what's culture? Anthropologists have been discussing this for a very long time. Like summarizing all of that, I'm very much influenced by this book by Baldwin and colleagues, where they summarized all these definitions on one hand, and also the work by anthropologists like Adam Cooper, trying to give an overview of how anthropology has been discussing culture and the definition of culture actually been changing over years as well. And what is pretty much the common standard or the common theme of defining culture in psychology, sociology, anthropology, management, and so on and so on, is the focus on meaning making. So how do people make meaning, create meaning in their lives? And then you can focus, for example, on structure and patterns, for example, what are the specific values? What are the functions of these value patterns? And how is that actually playing out? So the specific process. But it's all about meaning. And so a big question is, how well do we actually understand this meaning process? How well do we understand culture and cultural differences? And here is a recent paper which just came out, where it's part of a series of papers that we're working on, where we take existing theories, existing approaches, and we then test, like how much cultural variability is there in studies around the world, and how well can we then explain those differences. Like if you take existing theories and dimensions, can we explain whatever difference has been identified in the literature? So in this particular study, we reanalyzed meta-analysis, so it became a meta-analysis with nearly 1,000 studies overall. And then we use some meta-analytic techniques that allow us to break down the variability. So there are a couple of important points here. There's a lot of variability, pretty much the majority of the associations in this theory, the theory of planned behavior, which tries to explain intentions and through intentions behavior. The majority of the variability is actually at the within country level. So variability between studies, between situations, between behavior domains. Behavior domains actually don't explain that much. And cultural, so cross-cultural, cross-national differences is relatively small. What we can see is slightly higher variability whenever we use norms to try and predict either intentions and behavior, and the biggest variability at a country level, so cross-cultural differences, cross-national differences, we can identify for subjective norms trying to predict behavior. So that is really an important point. Basically, there is relatively little variability at the cross-national level, and then there's one set of correlations, one set of predictions within that model that shows much more cross-cultural variability. So now, how well can we explain that? We used a lot of different models and dimensions. So we tested 174, actually we tested more, but these are the ones where we had specific predictions based on the existing theories. And we used both ecological models as well as cultural meaning-making models. And out of those 174 possible effects, we had 6 significant results. So that's pretty poor outcome. And the other important observation here is it was mainly individualistic attitudes and beliefs predicting intentions. So we can best predict individualistic, like psychological concepts. We do not have a good grasp on norms and behaviors. What was cool though is those 6 predictions that came through, they were in line with the theory, but we also had a couple of I skipped that slide here. We also had a couple of unexpected results. So for example, power values had a strengthening effect on the relationship between perceived behavioral control and behavior, which means basically in contexts where individuals endorse power values more, perceived behavioral control had a stronger relationship with behavior, which was actually contrary to predictions from the literature, right? And interestingly, it's unexpected and it is about behavior. So something is going on here. So all our data here is typically based on self or other reports, right? So this is like one thing that we have to always remind ourselves of. How can we actually study self-reports? One of the first contributions is like the scales of measurement by Stevens, like who differentiate between different scaling levels. And then we need to we need to understand the true score, but humans always make errors. So this is the foundation of classical test theory or true score theory, where we assume that there is a true score which has an error component, and by including a number of different indicators, which then became like a latent factor model, we are able to estimate what that true score might be by including a number of indicators that are supposed to be measuring the same construct. So this is a foundational, like basically 3 different lines of 3 different ideas coming together, building the core of how we today measure self-reports. But how do we then make sure that we actually measure the same thing in different cultural contexts, right? So on one hand, there are all these papers that have talked about equivalence, like reporting Fons van de Weiber, really important in that literature. And here, for example, in the middle, there's, like I started my PhD in 1998, and 97, like their second edition of Methods and Data Analysis for Cross-Cultural Research came out. And, I was a poor student. The book wasn't really available in the UK and it was quite expensive. So, Fons was, like, I cherish that. He sent me, like the word proofs, and this is what it looks like, what I had, like for my PhD, it was like my little Bible for data analysis. So that they were very much influenced by Stevens' scaling approach. On the other hand, from a latent variable approach, you had, like the invariance literature, like with contributions by Meredith and then later Baumgartner and Steenkamp and others, right? And the idea is that you can estimate a model and then put certain restrictions on the model to see whether that deteriorates fit and tells you where there is a problem in that model somehow. And there are typically three major restrictions that you put on your model. The first one is you basically just test, like, is the same number of factors sufficient to provide good fitting model in the different cultural groups? If yes, then you start restraining the factor loadings, and that basically tests whether like the weight parameters or the numerical scores represent the same ordering of individuals in terms of the construct of interest. And then if that is if you have a positive result, then you can restrict the intercepts and test whether the numerical scores for each of the individual items captures the latent variable to the same extent in all the different groups. As you can see here, this is a table from Fontaine. There's an additional level of equivalence, which we don't have a test in the invariance literature. And there's a good reason for that, because it's a much more theoretical question. Basically, does the same theoretical variable exist in the first place? And so this is probably one of the main differences, like just at a practical level. The equivalence literature, working from a scaling and a bias equivalence approach, they also are concerned with the functional equivalence of constructs, whereas the invariance literature really starts from a psychometric testing perspective. So you start off with empirical testable models. Right, so but great, we have a tool, we can use it. Is it actually being used? And there are a number of studies now that have been done on the literature, which essentially show no, nobody is using these tools. These tools are available, nobody is using them. So, for example, this review in like published in JCCP by Diana Burr and colleagues, like reviewed JCCP studies and found essentially 18% reported some form of invariance testing. The numbers are actually much worse in PSPB. The numbers are much lower, and in developmental psychology they could not find a single paper that reported cross-cultural data that tested for equivalence. Much worse actually is the situation if you look at across a number of high rankings journals like Psych Science plus one. So that's the reason very very scary review by Marsden and colleagues. And so what they found was that like these days very few studies in these very high ranking data driven journals report invariance tests. And what is worse, if they provide tests, or if they provide the data and then you take that data and you test whether there was invariance in their data, like in psychology in general, most of the time we have non-invariance. So basically the scores cannot be compared. So it doesn't matter if it's an experiment or like a quasi-experimental correlational study. In a large number of studies, once you start testing for invariance, we do not even find a level of configurable invariance that would allow us to say that like over the course of a study, for example in an experiment or with different groups, that we're measuring the same constructs. So on the other hand though, like basically very few a small number of people test for invariance, and then on the other hand we have an increasing number of authors basically saying invariance should not be done. So we have this kind of real issue that like on one hand it seems to be important, people talk about it as being important. Nobody really reports it. And then an increasing number of people say, like, we should get rid of invariance altogether. So in a recent study that was published and came out late last year, we tried to bring in all that criticism, and most of it has to do with the statistical parameters and how the like these statistical rituals are being played out. And to be honest, I do agree with a lot of the criticism, and I think we have to critically reflect on these statistical rituals in a way that are being performed. If you just blindly follow some statistical cookbook without really thinking about what it gives you, then there is a problem. But, and I think this is important, we have to take one step back and think about how do people actually interact with surveys. And then from there, I come back to that invariance problem. Like, if you think about it, like people observe, like there are lots of experiences, lots of impressions streaming into our cognitive system all the time. So, like we observe, we receive information, and we may observe somebody like holding a gun and trying to rob us. So we have to perceive that. Obviously, it's a very traumatizing event, and we have to somehow store that and create some memories, some semantic memories. And the same thing, like for example, economic scarcity, like prices are increasing, inflation. We have to remember that. We have to consciously process that and memorize that. And the same thing, like we may have a pandemic. There might be concerns about diseases and so on and so on. And all this kind of information somehow needs to be integrated into schemas in our brain, right? So we have to categorize these events, we have to abstract them, integrate them, and then integrate them into episodic memory about specific events that have happened to us, and then like create some semantic memories of rules, knowledge of what to do, and then kind of combine them into, for example, in this case, it could be kind of, it's a dangerous world out there. So now, this is what we have in our mind. But then one day a researcher comes along and presents us some items. So the first thing is we have to read that item, and we have to like understand what the item actually says, which is you may think that's a stupid thing. You will be surprised how many people do not have functional levels of reading ability or do not understand certain words. And then having understood the item, then we have to go into retrieval mode, like think about events, categories that are relevant for answering that particular item, integrate all this information, and then we have to come to a decision of how we're going to answer that. So, like kind of decision trees, like, so I have this memory, so I see the response categories now. So does it, like apply to my situation, yes or no? So, and then we have to make decisions. Am I more in favor, less in favor? Is this more applicable, less applicable? And we make a decision. And in the end, we give some kind of response. So this is what survey responding, this is what happens during survey responding. So there's a lot of stuff happening cognitively. And with the whole process here, like we really have to ask ourselves, how is that process playing out in the minds of individuals in different cultural contexts when they're being confronted with items written by individuals that have often a very different understanding of the world, make meaning around their day-to-day activities in a rather different way, based often on relatively abstract literatures that may or may not be comprehensible to individuals. So I think we need to really get back to this idea of comparability, right? So on one hand, we have all this narrow statistical testing of internal validity parameters, like with all these invariance tests. But what we really would want, and which I think is the broader sense of invariance, is how comparable are our theory and data beyond these just specific statistical aspects, like how much can we actually, how much can we trust our data? And we use the term mapping, which comes from mathematics, as like the process of assigning objects in one particular set of objects in another set, right? So how much can we compare, for example, a response on a Likert type scale of 3 in one group with a response of 3 in another group? Or how much can we compare, for example, a construct like power values in one group with the construct of power values in another group, right? So we can, start thinking about this level of comparability in various different levels of hierarchy. So at a more conceptual level, or even down to the numerical level in our data sets. And so like our group, we really do a lot of stuff with the OSF, and they have a really nice way of breaking down a research process. And then we started thinking, so at what levels, where do these invariance questions actually come in? And this is, like one attempt, like trying to focus on some core questions throughout that whole research circle where invariance or equivalence issues are at stake. And I'm trying to break that down now, like according to those 5 major steps. There are other steps in there, but I think those 5 are, like very important ones. So the first one is functional equivalence. The idea here is to take ideas that people have in their minds, and then researchers have in their minds, and then how do they translate it into theoretical constructs and concepts, right? So what is the relative equality of these theoretical constructs and concepts within an explanatory coherent network, and is that actually comparable in different cultural contexts across different ecological, social contexts across time, and so on and so on. So in one of the papers we talk, for example, about like emotional categories like Heimweh in German and Saudades in Portuguese. Like to what extent can you actually linguistically equate them? Would people understand them? Like, or how similar is that to the concept of longing in English, right? And so I want to focus on a few specific points here. And like the core issue that like I want to stress here, it's a question of theory, right? So what is our construct? How do we label the bigger theoretical issue that we are interested in, and how do we identify specific, more fine-grained theoretical concepts that make up that larger construct, right? And then at the next step, which I will talk about in just a second, is how do we operationalize those concepts into indicators, which then form variables that link back to our constructs, right? So it's really about theory in the first place. So we have to be clear about our constructs and concepts before we can get into this whole, like operationalization. And so coming back to power, right? So in our academic literature, power is typically seen as very negative, as something that is morally bad in a way, it's exploitive, and so on and so on. But a lot of people in a lot of places around the world may actually have a rather positive view of power. Like the concept that comes to mind is, for example, mana in Polynesian cultures, right? So where, it has to do with spiritual life force, prestige, social status that you use. So you use your mana, you use your social status, your social power for the good of the community, right? And this is not actually too far-fetched. Here is a study that was published a few years ago with 281 Serbian adults, where they ask people how they understand values, what comes to mind, like the kind of behaviors, the kind of ideas come to mind when you ask them about all these different values. And I'm just focusing on power here in particular. There's really interesting stuff in that study showing that researchers have one academic definition of, for example, specific values, but lay people answering these surveys often understand them in a rather different way. And to just highlight that with the example of power, which actually was a more coherent one, power is understood in a number of different ways. So, for example, arrogance and manipulation, which was mentioned by most people in some form or another, is rather the negative aspect of benevolence. So it is power, but also, what they focus on is actually the negative aspect that is associated with the lack of benevolence. Another issue that came up a lot is actually related to achievement, right? So capability, being able to get things done, but also being competitive. You do stuff, you win, right? You break the rules to get to the top, but you work hard, you try hard, you're confident, and maybe this partially explains why we observe this really unexpected relationship between perceived behavioral control and behavior, right? So this was mentioned by about 20% of the adults, at least once. Or, power could be hedonism, right? A kind of materialistic sense of hedonism, right? So there are different ways of how you can understand power, and we don't know how, in those studies where power was measured, how participants really understood power, which then explains potentially the rather unexpected power effects in that meta-analysis. And so this is one of the, still at this conceptual level, talking now about the academic perspective, together with Ronaldo Pilati, we just had a paper of a review of a long line of research on culture-specific syndromes accepted. And there we make the argument that, culture-specific syndromes, they are often being used as these kind of weird concepts in the literature on culture that cannot be really compared across cultures. But what we are actually arguing is you could try and identify kind of building blocks that are common across cultural contexts, and then see how these building blocks are put together in kind of a Lego block fashion in unique ways in specific cultural contexts in order to solve practical problems. So we specifically focus on jeitinho brasileiro, which is a complex problem-solving strategy that is well documented in the anthropological literature. People talk about it a lot. And so the line of research that we have done has tried to focus on the psychological aspects of it. And what we find is that, for example, one of the examples, we give a couple of examples. If you take, for example, big five personality traits, what you can see is that they are being combined in unexpected ways from a Western perspective in order to solve problems. So, for example, jumping a queue, you have to make contact, it's a big problem in a lot of bureaucratic hierarchical contexts that you have long queues, inefficient bureaucracy, and so on and so on. So if you get to a bank and there's a long queue, how do you get to the front if you need to resolve something urgently? One option is you use your personal resources, your personality traits, for example, to make friends with people in the queue, right? So you're highly agreeable in some way. So you're very socially oriented. You're outgoing, so high in extroversion. So you take initiative, and you're open-minded. So you try to understand the other person, and then you strike up a conversation, make friends with, in a very short period of time, with people that you haven't met. You try and identify some kind of commonalities in order for that person, some people in the anthropological literature have talked about, spontaneous seduction, for that person then granting you or giving you permission to jump the queue and go to the bank teller, for example, straight away, right? So it's this kind of combination of basic building blocks in psychology, and then you can start looking at them across cultures. How are they being recombined, reorganized in a specific cultural context to solve cultural problems, right? So it's a conceptual, like a different way, a different conceptual way of trying to understand the world, right? And how can we, like this kind of theoretical approach, like how, the functions of these constructs, how do they, operate in different constructs? And this is the core issue that we have to get around in at this stage of the functional equivalence. So now another issue is, like the ontological nature of constructs. And now we're getting into one of the criticisms against the invariance literature, where people often argue, like, well, actually, this is a latent variable, like problem, right? So you have a latent variable that causes your indicators to perform in a certain way, right? But this really amazing paper, and there are a couple of other papers, but that was one of the earlier ones by Cruz and Morris. Actually, they say you can convert, the common core's latent variable paper, a reflective model, into a formative model where basically the indicators cause a latent or form a latent variable, or it could, under specific assumptions, you could actually consider it as a network, right? So mathematically, you can convert one into the other and back, right? So what really matters is how you theoretically conceptualize these relations, right? So this is where, the construct-concept relationship is really important. Like, what is your theory of how your constructs actually come about? Are they causal, like effects on indicators, like a reflective model? Are they organized like networks, so basically reciprocal relationships? Or do you assume that there is some kind of emergent property, so a formative model? And then the last thorny issue is here level of theories, which is a long-standing discussion in cultural research. Like at what level of theory, the individual level, the group level, the cultural level, do you position your argument? And so, like, for example, coming back to culture, there are very different conceptualizations of culture. Like, as I said, like a lot of them have to do with collective meaning making. And so Schwartz, one of the few papers that really tried to come up with a new idea, argued that culture is actually something latent which influences institutions, and then through those institutions influences individuals, and then by virtue of measuring these individuals, we can come back and measure the latent culture. Like Morris quite rightly, I mean, I look at this graph and I have problems understanding the level of direction of causality in this model, how you can get from one to the other, because like it feels like the ghost in the machine. There's this kind of magic thing that happens, and all of a sudden we can look at our data and we have cultural scores, right? So I have problems really following the logic flow in that causal model, right? And so I think it's actually more interesting to think through it in a rather different way. For example, using like the really excellent work by David Chan just across the water in Singapore about composition models. Like thinking through your theoretical process and then thinking through how you may actually convert that into indicators and how they may be phrased, right? And then another issue that is really, really important to think through is, like conceptually, what should data look like in order to support your theory? Another important issue to think through is the causal mechanisms, right? So, like through what mechanism are individuals affected by culture, and like to what extent does culture, like emerge through individual interactions, right? And so now we have tools for that, right? So Tyler Vanderwell, he does a lot of work conceptually on these issues. Like how can you differentiate, for example, a reflective model, right? So a latent variable model. Like what would need to happen in order for a reflective model to really explain some effect on some outcome variable. Like it should come through the latent variable. It should not really come through the individual items. And vice versa, for a formative model, like we would expect that, like these items, like if an individual, like endorses these items in a survey, for example, it really means, like there's some emergent property that we can measure, which then should influence some outcome variable. So there should be no direct effect from the indicators to the outcome variable. And of course, also another important question is, what's the role of variability in your theoretical model? So now, the composition models by Chen already kind of leads us directly into this operational equivalence. So how do we now transform our theoretical constructs and concepts into measurable stimuli? So, like what's the relative equality of the extent to which theoretical concepts are translated into empirical stimuli, items, indicators, questions that evoke the relevant and representative information about the intended theoretical concept in the same way across different cultural constructs. So if you start from scratch with a survey, like you can do a lot of things. If you use pre-existing data, you have additional challenges because, like you were not the person who came up with the theoretical constructs and operationalized them. Just to give you a couple of examples, it's actually a big problem in psychology in general. Researchers always invent their own new tools. And then, like we have the jingle jangle problem, right? So for example, here there's an example that we use in one of the papers. Like if we want to measure extroversion and we specifically focus on like being talkative, right? How is talkative being measured, right? So for example, just simply, is talkative, right? Easy. Or do you already put some kind of, like emphasis on I really enjoy, so kind of, like an enjoyment talking to people. Or do we talk about frequency? I talk a lot, don't talk a lot. Or, like you talk a lot whenever you have the opportunity. Or, all of these were kind of extroversion. But then talkativeness also comes up in other items measuring other dimensions, right? So, for example, is inclined to speak up, social initiative, or inquires about others' well-being, right? So, talking to others to find out how they're doing. So, which is already an indicator of compassion, agreeableness. So, different concept, right? And this gets more complex once we get into a cross-cultural context, right? So, like what term do we use? Like in Portuguese, falador, faladora, tagarela has a negative connotation. Tautala tala in Samoan is like talks too much, right? In German, like in some of the dialects in German, we have rather peculiar terms that imply really negative, like have negative implications. So it takes on a different meaning in all these languages, even though what we're trying to find out is, is somebody extroverted in the sense that they talk a lot to others. So how can we actually solve that? Like one process that we have found really useful in our group is response process evaluation, which is a mixed method approach where you use a lot of qualitative interviews, kind of web probing. We do it in a web context where you ask people, have you had the experience? Do you know what the item is all about? Describe when you were in a situation that was like that. Or if you haven't had the experience or you don't know or whether you have had or were in a situation like that, then we ask them to imagine what it was like. Then we analyze the responses in relation to some intended interpretations. And then if like a certain number of people, we use a threshold of 80%, are above the or show basically that they understood the question, then we're fine with the item. If not, we take the information from the responses and try and tune the item, so we go back to a new measurement process. So, and through this mixed methods approach, we try and see how many people actually understand the items, and then start to fine tune the items. And there's a lot of subjectivity. So we came up with a classification scheme where we always have 4 trained coders that look at these responses, and then we come up with some specific rules to speed up the process. And then you can end up with some kind of breakdown of items. So, for example, an established measure of experiences and which are common in a lot of clinical surveys, for example. We can look at now how many people actually understood these questions, and very surprising, for example, some items that are used in a lot of clinical scales measuring dissociation, psychotic experiences, are not understood. So they're being used in a lot of clinical surveys around the world, and people just don't understand them, which is concerning. So now, moving on to the next step in the measurement process, which is the actual moment when you do the measurement. So, like people see the stimuli, and then they have to take a numerical score. So this is where decision trees are really interesting. So there has been some really interesting work on simulations, trying to understand how people make decisions, how in specific data sets we can potentially see the decision process by individuals, to understand whether they use the same process or not in different groups. And this comes back to, again, for example, the questions of scaling. Like, what is the response format, and what are the kind of inferences that we can make from those responses about our data. And then the next process is, once we have our data, we can look at the parameters, right? So what is typically the invariance testing process. And we call it essentially an issue of symmetry. So symmetry of a set of observations, measurements of concepts in relation to each other across measurement occasions. So basically, an invariance test, the average invariance test, is a test of internal validity, internal relations, right? Unfortunately, often it's being treated as a yes-no kind of situation, but we actually argue that it's more informative to look at effect sizes to really understand, like which items have more of a problem or less of a problem, which items are more distant or less distant from the others. And then we have inferential equivalence. What do we do with all this information that we have gathered through our study, right? So we have empirical observations, we have our data, we have information about invariance tests. Now we have to bring that back to theory and, think about, reflect on what it all tells us. So what we really argue for is a holistic consideration and integration of all available empirical information across all samples, right? And then from there, using that invariance information, that statistical invariance information, and then put that back into kind of the theoretical frame. What are the implications for theory, for functional equivalence of our constructs, right? So basically, what is our theory and what have we learned, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we could take from our data, reflect on it, but there's also a lot of issues we need to be careful about. So for example, any kind of correlation can be contaminated by nomological noise. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in just a second. And we also always have to remember that stronger correlations are often observed for more poorly defined and operationalized variables. So that is also a common problem. If you have broad variables, they correlate typically with everything. If you have more narrowly defined, very precisely operationalized variables, they show smaller correlations and a more distinct pattern of correlations. So now, what are kind of implications? I think this is the really exciting part, right? So if we don't find invariance, and we assume it's a formative model, right? So there's some kind of emergent process. What it means is there are different forms of emergence. So we get to a certain state in different cultural contexts through different mechanisms, through different processes. And I think this is super exciting. Because this is one of the hard problems in the social sciences, this Harvard symposium a few years ago, right? How can we understand that process? And I think instead of just going like, well, ignore invariance, we have a correlation, that's it. Actually, the juice is in the process. If we don't have invariance, we have an amazing puzzle to solve, because it seems like that cultural processes operate very differently in different contexts. On the other hand, if we have a reflective kind of classic latent factor model, and we have non-invariance, it basically means there's some different cognitive mechanisms going on, or situational constraints that mean people cannot express, for example, their latent variables in the same way, right? So it shifts somehow the mechanism more towards the individual or the situation. Or in a network, we could have different activation patterns. So just to give you a few ideas of how this could be investigated in different domains or concept areas of research, right? So if we think about invariance as an internal validity problem, it can help us looking at this information to increase theoretical precision and rigor. For example, in the Schwartz value model, like a long-standing observation has been that certain items tend to move across cultural contexts, and Schwartz, for example, removed them from some of these items from his inventory. But then a reanalysis by Johnny Fontaine initially, and then we used the same data and did some more analyses, showed that you can actually understand when this is happening and where. Basically, we used here on the left hand, on the y-axis, we used some form of, it's kind of configural invariance. And we then plotted it against developmental indicators, so the Human Development Index or GDP, you name it. There are a couple of them that work quite similarly. And what you can see in lower income contexts, people don't make different distinctions, which then leads to these shifts that Shalom had observed. And so then we were like, how can we test this better? And I had a great opportunity to work with Waldine Gouveia with a different value model, using data from physicians around the country. And the amazing opportunity is we have a lot of economic variability within the same country, but everyone uses the same language. So we can rule out, some linguistic explanations. We can rule out a number of competing explanations. And we can really focus on the socioeconomic effects on the value responses. So we looked at the state level economic development or poverty indicators, and then we looked at socio-cultural living conditions, whether people live with their extended family in cramped living conditions, and obviously in more economically restricted conditions, people often live together with their extended family. And what we could show is that this then led to this different value structure. And the interesting thing is, there's a lot of migration within Brazil, and this migration actually, diluted these effects to some extent. once we took out those individuals that migrated, the pattern actually became much stronger, right? So it really shows that even like physicians that are highly educated, typically really well off, if they're embedded in these conditions, they start create meaning in a slightly different way, but it is systematic, it's predictable, and we can start understanding why we have these invariance problems, and it can give us a new way of grappling with cultural meaning making in different contexts. Similar processes have been studied with personality. There's a whole lot of literature that just looked at the factor intercorrelations, right? So the argument was if people are living in more socio-ecologically complex environments, they start to differentiate more and develop a more, there's a possibility to develop different personality profiles. What our research has suggested now is that these effects are actually due to differential interpretation of the items. So basically, people understand the items. So it is a socio-ecological complexity process, but it happens via the understanding of the items, how people understand the items and respond to those items, right? So it actually provides a different twist on that theoretical framework. And like invariance analyses, for example, more recently, this is a paper that just came out, can help to understand long-standing puzzles in the literature, for example, around intelligence, because we have the Flynn effect, like this increase in general intelligence over, decades, and then more recently, a reversal. How can we make sense of this? And what this recent study has shown is it has to do with how the individual components have changed over time due to to changing cultural conditions, right? So the specifically, like this decrease in the end has to do with, using tests that have often quite archaic words that people are not used to anymore. So basically, it becomes less, obvious intelligence marker. And on the other hand, figure completion tasks, like in the beginning, like when people started doing these tests in the 50s and 60s, people were not very familiar with them. These days, you do them all the time on online, and we're so used to them, so they also they become a less clear marker of IQ, right? So, and then the third one is solving math problems. Nobody solves math problems anymore. Like you use your computer, so your calculator on your phone. So people are not used to solving math problems anymore. So on one hand, we have increasing schooling effects that first led to this increase over the years, and then around the time when people became more and more dependent on cell phones, we see this reversal, right? So it's basically cultural change that explains that Flynn effect, but via different subcomponents of intelligence. So it's not people become smarter and they become dumber. No, they just strategically respond differently to items and solve these IQ tests differently. And this leads me to an interesting question. Should we actually expect invariance over time? A good example for me is always art, right? So for example, Picasso said, like, I painted this painting, it's an iconic painting of abstract art to obliterate the lessons of the past. And now, we will never look at paintings in the same way after this qualitative shift, should we actually expect metrical scalar invariance of these components over time? Because the mindset has changed. The meaning making around art has changed. So there's a new way of thinking. And I think this is, once we start thinking about values as meaning making concepts, with the contemporary environment, like polarization and so on and so on, should we actually expect that they perform in the same way today as they did 20 years ago? And so this is something I've been working on together with Johannes, taking all the ESS data. So on the left, you see the number of ESS rounds that are available with the value module by Schwartz. And then we tested for temporal invariance in all these different countries. And what is noteworthy, some of those countries, like Central European countries, where we have a lot of rounds, so we can actually look at temporal change, show that we basically have non-invariant structure. Yeah. So what this means is, values, their conceptualization has changed, right? So, coming back to that paper with those Serbian adults, how people think about values has changed. And this, is partly, again, coming back to this whole idea, people understand values in a number of different ways. And today, in contemporary samples, probably people understand values differently to what Shalom had in mind when he came up with the theory in the late 80s and early 90s, right? So I think it's exciting, it just shifts how we should think about this and start think about meaning making in the moment, what's happening with cultural change. So I think rigorous equivalence and invariance testing actually opens opportunities for much better theory and scientific progress. And as a last point, a lot of times these days, in the personality, in the political science literature, people have started talking about now let's ignore invariance, let's talk about external validity. Is this really the way forward? I think not really, because if we just focus on a variable and its correlations with something else, it becomes a black box and there's some kind of circularity, right? So because it's correlated with X, does it measure Y? I don't know. And how do you actually choose X, right? This is theory dependent. So you become really dependent on a specific theory, but you can't actually compare different theories anymore because you have this black box. You don't know what it measures. You only know it measures, it has a correlation with Y, right? So the issue is internal and external validity are complementary. You need external validity. It's useful to study that, but you also need internal validity. Another cheeky point is those other variables, the criterion, also need to be valid, so you have to do some separate invariance test on it. And another point that, we have made in a paper a few years ago is nomological noise scales up across levels. So, if you, for example, in this case, you have two variables and both of these variables have a true latent correlation, let's say of 0.3, but both of them, for example, have a method effect associated with them. And then you just look at the higher level, level 2 cultural correlation. If that method effect increases, the correlations become larger, right? So this method effect then drives the level 2 correlation up. So the fact that you have a strong, level 2 correlation could actually mean you have a measurement problem at level 1, right? So you have to consider the issue of nomological noise. And a last, point for me is if you start talking about external validity after you have had some problems with internal validity, there's a bit of a problem. I'm really in favor of external validity as, building it into your theoretical process right from the start with the functional equivalence questions, right? Because this is what functional equivalence is all about, external validity, criterion validity. But then it should really become the center, the core of your thinking right from the start. So suggestions for the way forward. This is a process model where we looked at the clinical intervention literature and tried to integrate various processes also from this equivalence and bias framework. And there are 2 points. The first one is really work with the community, assess the community as an outsider and work with them. As a cross-cultural psychologist, you can't do anything unless you talk to people, unless you try and understand what's going on in the minds of individuals, and also try and understand the problem, from their perspective. What is the problem And don't start with kind of preconceptions. For example, our work with Jaitinho is a classic example. If you come with a Western perspective, it's corruption. But once you start looking at it from a local perspective, it's creativity, it's relationship building, and it's also a bit of corruption, right? So it it really requires this engagement with the communities. Of course, this is difficult if you do a 20-country study, but then you work with collaborators. And then in our papers, we have a number of questions that can be considered to help people, help researchers, think through some of these issues. And ultimately, I think we need to have an integration across levels. I think the concept of consilience, that we have convergence across, or we study processes across different levels. This is the way forward. This is how we can understand culture. This emergent process and this top-down process. How can we really get to understand culture if we just restrict it to one level of analysis? So should we throw out invariance testing, or should we treat data, as David Funder says, but came up to different conclusions? I think he's right. We should treat data as data, but then also use invariance test information to guide us and give us new insights about meaning-making process. All right. Thank you so much, and I'll look forward to discussing this further with you.